The words hung in the air like a shroud, thick and suffocating. She's not my daughter. It wasn't shouted, not in anger, but delivered with a chillingly calm finality, as if he were stating the weather. My breath hitched, a shallow, painful thing in my chest. The fluorescent light of the hospital hallway seemed to bleach all color from the room, leaving only the stark white of the walls, the pale blue of his scrubs, and the ashen hue of my own face. He didn't meet my eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond my left shoulder, a practiced detachment in his posture. My mother, frail and fading on the gurney, was being wheeled past, oblivious, a gentle morphine haze blurring her perceptions. He turned, a slight, almost imperceptible shrug, and walked away, leaving me alone with the echoing void of his declaration. This was not a sudden storm, it was the culmination of a lifetime of subtle erosion, a slow drip of dismissal and disregard that had finally worn away the bedrock of my existence. My childhood was a landscape painted in muted tones of conditional affection. He was a man of pronouncements, his opinions carved in stone, his moods dictating the climate of our home. My mother, bless her gentle soul, navigated his storms with quiet resilience, her love for me an unshakable constant that somehow managed to shield me from the worst of his pronouncements. But even her protection had its limits. I remembered one summer, I must have been 10, painstakingly building a birdhouse from scraps of wood. It was lopsided, the paint job a haphazard mess of primary colors, but it was. I'd proudly presented it to him, expecting a grunt of approval, perhaps even a rare smile. Instead, he'd circled it with disdain. Honestly, Amelia, this is pathetic. A waste of time. Go read a book. The disappointment had stung, a sharp, unexpected jab. He never encouraged my creative endeavors, his praise reserved for academic achievements or, more significantly, for the offspring of his more successful friends. Another memory, much later, during my university years. I was struggling, juggling a demanding course load with a part-time job to make ends meet. He'd been visiting, ostensibly to offer support, but his conversation quickly devolved into a litany of his own accomplishments. He spoke of his business dealings, his investments, the ease with which he'd navigated his own academic path. When I timidly mentioned my financial strain, the sheer exhaustion of it all, he'd waved a dismissive hand. Stop complaining, Amelia. Everyone has to work hard. If you'd made better choices, perhaps chosen a more lucrative field, you wouldn't be in this situation. There was no empathy, no understanding, just a judgment that felt like a brand. He saw my struggles not as a challenge to be overcome, but as a personal failing, a reflection of his own perceived inadequacy in raising a truly successful progeny. It was during these moments, bathed in the icy glow of his disapproval, that I learned to retreat, to build my own internal fortress of quiet observation. The day at the hospital was different. It wasn't about a birdhouse or university tuition. It was about my mother. She'd been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer months prior, and her decline had been swift and brutal. He, of course, had maintained his stoic facade, offering perfunctory visits and the occasional terse phone call. But I was there. Every day. I held her hand, stroked her thinning hair, whispered reassurances even when my own voice trembled. I navigated the labyrinthine hospital bureaucracy, badgered doctors for answers, and personally ensured her comfort. He, on the other hand, had been absent. He'd shown up for her appointments, yes, but he'd always seemed distracted, impatient, his eyes darting towards his watch. He treated her illness like an inconvenience, a public spectacle that disrupted his carefully curated life. And then came the moment. The doctors had given her only days, perhaps hours. I'd managed to get her transferred to a private room, a small solace in the midst of the storm. He'd finally arrived, not with flowers or a comforting word, but with a grim determination etched on his face. He'd cornered me in the sterile waiting area, away from the hushed reverence of my mother's room. The air conditioning hummed, a monotonous drone that did little to cool the heat rising in my cheeks. Amelia, he began, his voice low, clipped. Your mother. She's been talking. About arrangements. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Arrangements? What do you mean? He sighed, a sound of profound weariness, as if burdened by the sheer idiocy of my question. Her will. She's been making changes. My stomach lurched. My mother, even in her weakened state, had always been fiercely independent. But the idea of her making changes to her will, without consulting me, felt strange. Changes? What kind of changes? He looked at me then, his eyes, usually so guarded, now held a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Not sadness, not concern. It was something colder. She's been persuaded, shall we say, by certain outside influences. A chill snaked down my spine. I knew exactly who those outside influences were, his siblings, his nephews, vultures circling an inheritance they felt entitled to. They'd always seen my mother as a soft touch, a means to an end. Persuaded how? I pressed, my voice barely a whisper. He finally met my gaze, and that's when he said it. The words, so simple, so devastating. She's been made to understand, quite clearly, that certain discrepancies in the family lineage mean that any significant bequests to you would be illogical. Frankly, Amelia, she's been convinced that you're not my daughter. The world tilted. The humming of the air conditioner intensified, a deafening roar in my ears. Not his daughter. The words were nonsensical, a twisted, grotesque fabrication. I was his daughter. I carried his name. I looked like him, my mother always said, especially around the eyes. Yet, the conviction in his voice, the absolute certainty, was terrifying. He wasn't saying it as a cruel joke, he was stating a fact, a justification for what? For cutting me out? For aligning himself with his greedy family? My mother's voice, weak and raspy, drifted from the room. Amelia, are you there, darling? I took a shuddering breath, forcing myself to stand tall, to push back against the tsunami of disbelief and hurt. I couldn't crumble. Not now. Not when she needed me. I managed a weak smile, a mask to conceal the wreckage within. I'm here, Mama. Just a moment. I turned back to him, my voice carefully modulated, betraying none of the seismic shift that had just occurred within me. And you believe this? He gave a short, humorless laugh. Believe it? Amelia, it's a matter of documented fact. She's finally seen reason. He didn't see my hands clench into fists, the nails digging into my palms. He didn't see the icy resolve hardening in my eyes. He saw a daughter finally accepting her place, a malleable pawn being moved into position. He was so utterly, gloriously wrong. The drive home that night was a blur of unshed tears and silent fury. The sterile scent of the hospital clung to me, a grim reminder of what I had witnessed. My father, the man who had delivered that judgment, was now on a collision course with consequences he couldn't possibly anticipate. The realization that he would actively participate in, and perhaps even orchestrate, this slander was a betrayal of the deepest kind. He hadn't just denied my existence, he had actively participated in its erasure, all for what? To appease his family? To protect his reputation? The specifics of his motives felt less important than the act itself. My grandmother, my mother's mother, had passed away years before my father's pronouncement. She had been a woman of quiet strength, a keeper of family history and, more importantly, of family secrets. Her will had been meticulously drafted, a testament to her foresight. After her death, my mother had inherited her childhood home, and with it, a substantial collection of personal effects. Among these was a large, ornate wooden box, dark mahogany with brass fittings, which my mother had kept in the attic of her own home. It was filled with letters, photographs, legal documents, and other ephemera of generations past. After my grandmother's passing, my mother had entrusted me with the responsibility of cataloging its contents, a task I had undertaken with a sense of reverence. It was a quiet, solitary pursuit, a way to connect with a lineage I felt increasingly disconnected from. The next morning, I woke with a singular focus. The hospital, my dying mother, my father's betrayal, it all coalesced into a cold, sharp clarity. I drove to my mother's house, the one she would likely never see again. The air was heavy with the scent of wilting flowers and the metallic tang of illness. The box was in the attic, just as I remembered. It was heavy, its contents dense with the weight of years. I carried it downstairs, not to my mother's room, but to the living room, a space that had always felt more communal, more public. I spread the contents of the box across the polished oak floor. Old photographs of my grandmother as a young woman, stern but with kind eyes. Letters written in elegant, spidery script. And then, tucked away in a sealed manila envelope, a birth certificate. Not mine. It was my grandmother's. And next to it, another document, a sworn affidavit. The names on these documents were unfamiliar, the dates ancient. I spent hours that day, meticulously sifting, cross-referencing, piecing together a narrative that had been deliberately obscured. I found a photograph of my grandmother, very young, standing beside a man who was not my grandfather. Beside it, a letter. The language was formal, laced with archaic phrasing, but the meaning was starkly clear. A child had been born, a daughter, conceived out of wedlock. And that child, my grandmother's eldest daughter, had been given up for adoption. The legal documents confirmed the adoption, the change of surname, the severing of ties. And then I found it. Tucked beneath a stack of faded wedding invitations, a document I recognized from my own legal studies. A notarized acknowledgement of paternity. It was dated years before my own birth. The names on it were my father's and my grandmother's eldest daughter. The signature of the notary was clear, the seal impressed. My father had acknowledged paternity of another woman's child, a child born before he met my mother. The implications crashed over me, not with the force of a tidal wave, but with the relentless pressure of the ocean floor. My father, a man so obsessed with lineage and legacy, a man who had just disavowed me, had a secret. A significant, life-altering secret that directly contradicted his pronouncements. He wasn't the biological father of the child he had acknowledged paternity for. That child was the product of another man's union, a union my father had evidently claimed. I didn't confront him immediately. The satisfaction wouldn't come from a heated argument or a public shaming. It would come from a precise, surgical unveiling. I called my mother's lawyer, an old family friend who had handled my grandmother's and my mother's estate planning. I explained, calmly, precisely what I had found. I sent him copies of the documents. He reviewed them, his initial professional skepticism melting into a quiet astonishment. "Amelia," he'd said, his voice measured, "this is substantial. If what you're presenting is accurate, and it appears to be, your father has not only been dishonest about your parentage, but he is also engaged in significant deception regarding this other child." The plan formed with chilling efficiency. My mother's condition worsened rapidly. The family, the vultures my father had so eagerly aligned himself with, began to circle closer, their hushed tones and expectant glances a testament to their greed. They believed my father's words, his narrative of disinheritance. They saw me as a loose end, an inconvenience. The day after my mother's passing, while the initial shock and grief still held sway, I met with my father and his siblings at my mother's house. The air was thick with forced condolences and thinly veiled anticipation of the reading of the will. My mother's lawyer was present, his demeanor grave. My father sat in my mother's favorite armchair, his posture radiating a weary authority. His siblings flanked him, their faces a mixture of feigned sorrow and keen interest. I sat on the sofa, a quiet observer. The lawyer began, his voice resonating in the hushed room. He outlined the various bequests, the distribution of assets, all as my mother had meticulously planned. When he reached the clause regarding the division of a substantial trust fund, my father leaned forward, a glint in his eye. This was the part he was most interested in. "And as for Amelia," the lawyer continued, his gaze steady, "your mother explicitly stated that due to certain, documented inaccuracies in the family tree, and the subsequent legal acknowledgments made by Mr. Davies himself years prior, any direct inheritance to her would be untenable. She therefore designated her estate's residual portion to be held in trust for the primary beneficiary of Mr. Davies's acknowledged paternity, pending verification. A collective gasp rippled through the room. My father's face, which had been set in a triumphant smirk, slackened. His siblings exchanged confused, then alarmed, glances. What are you talking about?" my father stammered, his voice suddenly losing its gravelly authority. I remained silent, my gaze fixed on him, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. The lawyer then produced the documents from the mahogany box. The birth certificate, the affidavit, the notarized acknowledgement of paternity. He laid them out on the coffee table, each one a small, silent bomb. "Your mother was aware of these documents, Mr. Davies," the lawyer stated, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And she ensured that your own legal admissions would dictate the course of your inheritance, as well as the disposition of this trust. Specifically, the trust fund designated for the child you acknowledged paternity for is to be distributed to that child, under the condition that you yourself are not the primary beneficiary, but rather the child whose biological father is recorded on the original birth certificate." The room plunged into a stunned silence. My father's face drained of all color. His siblings stared at him, their mouths agape, the greedy anticipation in their eyes replaced by dawning horror and accusation. The casual dismissal, the condescending pronouncements, the calculated lie, it all came crashing down on him. He had disowned me based on a fabricated truth, only to discover that his own carefully constructed paternal lineage was a sham. He had claimed paternity of a child who wasn't his, a child who, in this convoluted twist of fate, was the rightful heir to a significant portion of his own family's wealth, a wealth he believed was his birthright. The ensuing chaos was a symphony of screeching voices and frantic accusations. His siblings, realizing their own inheritance was now in jeopardy, turned on him with a ferocity that was almost satisfying to witness. Text messages, frantic and accusatory, flooded my phone. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly felt the need to mediate, to understand. Flying monkeys, deployed by my father, attempted to cajole, to guilt, to threaten. But I was beyond their reach. The quiet execution was complete. There was no shouting, no tears, just a profound sense of stillness. I had opened Grandma's box, and in its dusty confines, I had found the truth. And with that truth, I had dismantled the carefully constructed facade of my father's ego, piece by painstaking piece. He had wanted to sever ties, to declare me not his daughter. In the end, he had only succeeded in revealing his own fraudulent lineage, his own paternity a lie. The silence that followed his downfall was, for me, the sweetest sound imaginable. It was the sound of justice, delivered not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable turning of forgotten pages.